Hi, I'm Renato and these are my cinematic settings on the A7S II. So we're gonna start with the basics. If you didn't watch my video on photography basics, the link is up here for you to watch. There I cover ISO, aperture and shutter speed. So beginning with ISO, I leave it as low as possible. So the lowest amount I can. So I always leave it on the lowest amount I can because that gives me the sharpest image possible. But sometimes if I'm in a low light situation, I have to bump it up. Now the aperture is always the fastest possible, so the widest possible. So if I'm shooting with this lens, which is a 1.8, I usually use it in 1.8 or sometimes f2.2, 2.5 because sometimes it's a little bit sharper with higher f-stops. But I'm usually using it at 1.8 and this lens is a 24-70 f4. I'm using it at f4 right now. So the aperture is the widest possible, the fastest possible, so it lets the most amount of light in the sensor, therefore the background is out of focus. Now when it comes to shutter speed, there's a rule that you have to follow. When you're shooting videos, there's always the FPS, which is the amount of frames per second that your camera is recording. So the shutter speed that I use is always double the amount of frames per second that I'm recording. So if I'm recording 24 frames, 1/50. If I'm recording 60 frames per second, 1/125, and so on. It's not exactly double, but it's approximately. Now when talking about FPS, I usually shoot at 24 frames per second, and that is the most cinematic aspect that you can get. So I'm shooting right now in 24 frames per second in 4K. I'll get into resolution later. But when you shoot 4K, you cannot do slow motion. For you to do slow motion, you need higher frame rates. So then you can slow it down in post-production. So you need something like 60, 120, 240, or as many as you want, and as many as your camera allows you to. So when I'm shooting B-roll, I'm usually using 60 frames per second so I can get that slow motion look. I would rather shoot 120 FPS because the higher the frame rate, the more slow motion you're gonna get out of the footage. But my camera has a limitation in which when I shoot 120 FPS on it, it crops by 2.2 times, which sucks. So if I'm shooting a wide angle scene, I'm usually shooting in 60 FPS because I shoot my wide angle scenes on the 24-70. So if I actually shoot it in 120 FPS, I'll get a 2.2 crop and I'll have the field of view of 48 plus, what is 24 divided by 5 is, so I'll have close to 53 millimeters instead of 24 millimeters of field of view if I shoot in 120 FPS, and that's why I usually shoot in 60. Now when it comes to resolution, I'm most of the time shooting in 1080p because that's how I can record slow motion. So if I'm recording slow motion, either 60 or 120 FPS, I have to shoot in 1080 because that's what my camera allows me. Now if I want to shoot 4K, I'll have to shoot 24 frames per second, which I do every time I don't need slow motion on my footage. Right now I'm talking to the camera, I don't need slow motion, so I'm gonna shoot in 24 frames per second, and therefore I'll shoot in 4K because my camera allows me to shoot 4K in 24 FPS, but it doesn't allow me to shoot 4K in higher frame rates, so that's when I go to 1080p. Now when talking about color, it's subjective. Some people like to have flat color profiles, some people like to have saturated and contrasted color profiles on their cameras. I usually like to have flat color profiles because I can get the most out of it in post. So right now this is the footage without color grading and this is the footage with color grading. You see there's a massive difference because I'm shooting in a flat color profile, and by that I mean you can shoot in log, you can shoot in cine-like, you can shoot in Rec 709, which is standard, but you can also choose color profiles with some kind of theme, so portrait, landscape. I don't recommend those because you can do that later in post-production instead of letting your camera choose the saturation and contrast for you. So I used to use S-Log3 on my A7S II, which is a really flat color profile, but I don't do that anymore because it takes a lot of time to color grade, and at the same time it isn't as cinematic as this other one that I found that I'm gonna talk about later. And also, when you shoot S-Log, you have two downsides, which is the lowest ISO you can get is 1600, which is a high ISO, and also you gotta expose it 2 stops overexposed so you can get the most out of it, and it sucks. It's hard to shoot with that high ISO and with that high exposure. You gotta always overexpose your footage by 2 stops, which is a lot, and it's hard to remember sometimes. So I just switched to Cine 4, which is great. I really like Cine 4 because it's flatter than Rec 709. It's what I'm shooting right now, Cine 4. And the settings that I got for it, I saw on a video on YouTube. I forgot who made the video, but yeah. So I use black level +2, gamma obviously Cine 4. The black gamma is wide and the level is +4. The knee, I leave it in manual. I use it at 95% and the slope is +5. The color mode, I use it in Pro. The saturation and color phase, I leave at 0, and the detail is always in -2, so I can add sharpening on the post. Now when it comes to white balance, if I'm on the go, if I'm running, if I don't have much time, sometimes I leave it in auto because it does a great job of finding the autofocus. One thing that I find really annoying of using auto white balance is when it changes the value during the recording, so the footage is actually different throughout the clip, which sucks, but it's helpful when you are on the go. But most of the times I have those presets, so you got daylight, sunny, cloudy, cool white, warm white, tungsten, and you got many presets for you to choose. Right now I'm using cool white because it matches well with this light. I know I have to change it up a little bit in post, but it matches okay with the light. So if I'm in a control situation and I know that I want to get the most out of footage and I want the sharpest footage possible, I will choose the auto balance manually. So I will adjust it so that the blues and the yellows and the magenta and the green are perfect according to the lighting. So that's it. Those are my cinematic settings on the A7S II. I hope you liked this video. If you did, make sure to leave that thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you aren't already so you can watch the next videos. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter at RenatoDepp_. The link is in the description below. But the most important thing is that you listen to my podcast every Tuesday and Thursday. There's a new podcast for you to watch on YouTube or listen on your favorite podcast app, either on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn. You got many choices. So please go ahead and listen to that because I really believe in the power of podcasts. I think it's the future of communication because people want to watch the content but they don't have time. So they listen to the podcast because they can do it while they are washing the dishes, while they are driving to work, while they're riding the bike, working out, walking the dog. That's why I really believe in podcasts. So that's it. I'll catch you in the next one.